It's February 2018 and 30 days before Cape Town runs dry. The reservoirs in the South African city are straining under the pressure of a perfect rainless storm. After 3 years of low precipitation, Cape Town is preparing for day zero, a countdown to when there is no water left in the taps. Faced with the prospect of nothing to wash in or even to drink, day zero becomes shorthand for a looming climate disaster. A potential powder keg for unrest. There are hosepipe bans, 30-second showers, a plea to think twice before flushing. Each household was asked to keep water use below 50 litres a day per person, about a fifth the normal use.
As I record this message, the projection is that Cape Town will run out of water sometime early in April.
One solution was more outrageous than others. 4,000 kilometres south of Cape Town was an unlimited reserve of ice-cooled drinking water. Icebergs. The idea of harvesting ice from the South Sea near Antarctica was floated as a plan of desperation. Speaking at an emergency summit, Captain Nick Sloan claimed a single iceberg could provide a third of Cape Town's water for a year. He was used to providing big solutions to large problems, such as salvaging capsized cruise ships. Of course, day zero never arrived. Neither did the iceberg. But it's a solution that has continued to surface as droughts grow longer and pressures on drinking water heats up. It's not the last time we'll hear it. When you factor in that 2 trillion tonnes of ice break off Antarctica each year, it becomes easier to imagine. Not to mention affordable. That's the equivalent of half of all fresh water used globally for industry, agriculture, or domestically. However, harvesting ice raises concerns not only from a practical point. You can't just sail to Antarctica and carve off a block of ice. At the 60th parallel, you run up against a 60-year-old agreement that governs the region. To understand how the continent works, you can't avoid talking about it. Visits, resources, what you can and can't do. The treaty is the rulebook at the South Pole that dictates everything. Drinking water from Antarctica is just the tip of the iceberg. Antarctica is the last place on Earth to be reached by humans. So how is it so difficult to say who got there first? And why does everyone want a slice of what seems to be the world's most inhospitable continent? My name is Thomas Bywater. In March 2020, while stranded on a ship in the Drake Passage, I had the opportunity to meet some of the adventurous characters drawn to Antarctica and learn some of its surprising episodes. Stories of archaeological hoaxes, murders in a continent without police, and a research station baby boom. In the span of just 200 years, the 7 countries with claims and permanent footholds at the bottom of the world have developed rich, sometimes contradictory histories, New Zealand amongst them. This podcast aims to explore some of these episodes and see if Antarctica's short history could go back further than first thought. This is Detour Antarctica. What is the Antarctic Treaty? In short, it's a miracle. Drawn in 1959, it might be the only thing the former USSR and USA ever saw eye to eye on. Fittingly, it was signed at the height of the Cold War. Berlin had just been divided in two. Cuba had been overthrown by Comunistas. The first Americans had been killed in Vietnam. In spite of seeing the world from almost polar opposites, the two adversaries could agree on one thing. Antarctica should remain neutral. So what exactly did they agree on? The fundamentals are straightforward. Its articles are divided into 4 main areas. Firstly, that the South Pole should be nuclear-free. No bombs, no bases, no disposal of nuclear waste. Secondly, it would be a peaceful area set aside for scientific cooperation. Research should be unimpeded, plans and results freely shared. Thirdly, that all territorial disputes and claims be frozen. 7 countries, including New Zealand, hold territorial claims on the land. These boundaries are suspended as they were, which is unusual, particularly as the treaty holds in place areas of overlapping and competing claims. Finally, there are articles of dispute and modification. I won't bore you with them, the typical legalistic housekeeping you'd expect. However, some of the biggest clues for predicting the treaty's future are buried away in these details. As we'll see in future episodes, these simple rules haven't always been easy to follow. In spite of its age, the treaty is holding up well. Only one founding country has ever left, and that was the USSR when it dissolved, and its place was quickly taken by the Russian Federation. From the original 13, there are now over 50 countries signed up to the rules. Protections for wildlife and bans on mining have also been added. In short, it's the most successful agreement of its kind. But that's not to say it isn't without problems. Dr. Alan Hemmings almost caused one.
So, I was working for the British Antarctic Survey, and we were, and Sydney is a biological base, and I was there as a biologist. But the very arcane, when I went there, communications from Britain's bases was all by high-frequency link. So high-frequency link to cable and wireless station in Port Stanley, and then it went up through various radio stations in the Atlantic up into the British domestic system and into Cambridge. When the Argentines captured Stanley, we lost that link.
Throughout the day, we had no communication from the government of the Falklands. By late afternoon yesterday, it became clear that an Argentine invasion had taken place and that the lawful British government of the islands had been usurped.
The Falkland Islands War, one of the most curious and tragic wars of the 20th century, had begun. But few people realise that it stretched right into the subantarctic islands. In Hemmings' case, it was affecting operations within the Antarctic Circle. Now an associate professor at the University of Canterbury's Antarctic Centre, back in 1982, he was a conservation researcher at the peninsula. When Port Stanley surrendered, the British Antarctic Survey became the only link back to the UK. It was his job to pass on the message that their colleagues were being invaded.
Because we were all young men on an Antarctic station, and most of the wireless operators working for cable and wireless in Stanley were young women, and we never met any of them. They were just voices right over. And I remember one of them, after the Argentines had taken over, saying sort of as quiet as you can over the radio, "There are lots of Argentines here and it's quite frightening."
While Hemmings and Sydney Base found a workaround to get the messages back to England, they became an accidental listening post for the South Atlantic, which didn't sit easily with the peaceful ideals of Antarctica. He was meant to be studying polar skua birds, not mediating a war.
Well, one of the questions I asked myself was, am I in breach of the Antarctic Treaty? Am I engaging in measures of a military nature? I didn't think I was at the time, but I must say, as a young man in my mid-20s, caught up in the jingoism of war viewed from afar, I'm not sure it would have altered my judgment, even if I thought that it was borderline. But I'm confident that we were not engaged in passing information about the conduct of military activity. It was about trying to find out where British Antarctic Survey people had ended up.
The war, which came right up to the edge of the Antarctic Circle, was a pointless loss of some 800 lives. But it showed the length to which countries are willing to go to prop up their historic claims to Antarctica. 40 years on, Hemmings is now a professor of Antarctic governance in Christchurch. The Falklands were his first taste of polar realpolitik. The war may have happened in the Falklands and Georgia, but it was over claims in Antarctica. It was a plan to muscle out the competition. It's a sign that even in the 1980s, some treaty parties were making contingency plans, just in case it could come up for review.
La Antártica, como un continente que lejos de ser inhóspito está repleto del denominado oro azul.
Within the final clauses of the treaty is a detail that suggests it could be more fragile than first thought. Some alarmist interpretations have zeroed in on a particular date that they see as a potential endpoint for the treaty. It's been called a sunset clause, after which any party member may seek to modify the terms. In 2048, the current treaty becomes modifiable, and those with claims in Antarctica could be free to do as they please.
You are looking at men on a hunt. The game they seek is not a living thing, and their weapons are not firearms. But they are hunting, and they are armed with the weapons of science.
The most obvious motive for ending the treaty is in order to get at what lies beneath the ice. Greed, pure and simple. The moment the duration of the treaty ends, it will be roughnecks in the South Seas, oil derricks in Antarctica, Daniel Day-Lewis types given free rein, and there will be blood played out in the pristine southern ice.
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
This danger may have been exaggerated. It isn't the first time there's been an opportunity to exploit Antarctica for natural resources. Instead of some hypothetical doomsday, let's look back at the last time prospecting reached fever pitch. It's the 1990s. Europe is waking from the long hangover of the Iron Curtain, or at least reunification. MC Hammer holds the #1 single for New Zealand. Cinemas are playing Die Hard 2, Back to the Future Part 3, and Rocky 5. Things are looking pretty rosy, particularly if you are sitting on a barrel of oil. Events like the USSR's slow tottering out of existence and Iraq's occupation of Kuwait have driven oil prices to their highest point for a decade. The stage was set for the First Gulf War, before there was any scope for a sequel. The reliable sources of oil that had kept the wheels greased and the world ticking over were looking less certain. So they started to look elsewhere. There was a lot of interest in what might be found under the ice. The University of Tokyo had discovered traces of coal and organic chemistry in a handful of topsoil sites in Antarctica's McMurdo Dry Valley. The idea that there might have once been a greener period in the continent's history was a fairly new one. It suggested there could be substantial build-up of fossil fuels on the rich seabeds. A preliminary report by the US Geological Survey was commissioned. Even under their conservative calculations, there was oil in them there icebergs. It is estimated, if recovery were made under conditions generally extant throughout the world, there would be resources of 19 billion barrels of recoverable oil and 106 trillion cubic feet of gas, amounting to 36 billion barrels of oil equivalent in Antarctica. However, this dream of mineral riches under Antarctica was about to be put on ice. In Spain, treaty members decided to make the biggest change to date. It would come to be called the Madrid Protocol, though where it was agreed on is less important than what was agreed. Antarctica was to be a reserve for nature as well as science. Any activities now had to be non-detrimental to water or air quality. It banned extractive activities and ended research into prospecting for potential fossil fuel deposits on the continent, which was definitely a positive thing. But it has also been blamed for what has been called the El Dorado effect. Having banned physically searching for it, estimations on Antarctica's mythical oil have been allowed to run wild. Previous estimates as far back as the 1970s and 80s had Antarctica's potential oil reserves as being as high as 203 billion barrels of oil. That would put Antarctica firmly behind Saudi Arabia as the third biggest reserve in the world. Like the conquistadores before, there was some truth to the rumours behind this mineral wealth and the mystery. The Madrid Protocol has meant that the oil El Dorado only looms larger in legend. Even today, Chilean and Argentine commentators talk about l'oro azul and el continente blanco, blue gold from the white continent. So again we hear the drumbeat of 2048, the year when the protocol comes up for review. As treaty members begin planning base redevelopments during the next decade, it doesn't take a lot of speculating to realise that this new generation of Antarctic infrastructure is gearing up in time for the review. 2048 is like the Y2K at the South Pole, the Millennium Bug. It's a theoretical dateline that, depending on which camp you're in, it either changes everything or nothing. So where did the date come from?
I had to bring my protocol. I carried it around with me all the time, but...
I said it was short, but it's quite a booklet that you have there.
Well, yeah.
An original printing from...
Yeah, I've had it for a wee while.
Head of Policy for Antarctica New Zealand, the treaty is a document Ceisha Poirot cannot escape, as her own dog-eared and highlighted copy shows.
Since it's entered into force, I think 2 of the annexes have had minor updates made to them. So this misnomer that we have to wait until 2048 for it to be reviewed is it's a misnomer. It's just not true. So anybody can bring forward a proposal to review the protocol, and the treaty system works on the consensus basis. So if all members or all parties agree, then it will be agreed. So this 2048 figure comes from if after the expiration of 50 years from the date of entry into force of this protocol, any of the consultative parties could request by communication a conference to be held as soon as practical to review the operations of this protocol. So this particular passage around 50 years is where this 2048 comes from, but it just should be noted that it can be reviewed at any point in time. We don't have to wait until 2048 for it to be reviewed.
2048 is a sort of Antarctic bogeyman. Yes, it becomes slightly easy to modify the treaty in 30 years, but there's very little stopping any member from walking away from the treaty today. Still, as countries count down to the review, they're watching one another's Antarctic ambitions with increasing suspicion. With each commissioning of a new ice runway and reinforced polar navy destroyer, they're bolstering their own 30-year plans. There's a danger that 2048 may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So is the frenzy of new base pledges a sign that countries are hedging their bets? The sensational headline is often seized upon by reporters in the region, particularly when discussing newcomers to the continent.
China is rapidly building new bases, leading to calls for Australia to keep a closer eye on exactly what it's doing.
Antarctica is thought to be rich in oil, gas and mineral reserves, although mining has long been banned there. Could that be about to change?
You hear it in the headlines. China eyes Antarctica's resource bounty, wrote The Guardian, when the country installed its fourth base, Taishan, on the ice in 2014. China is the fastest-growing, best-funded presence on the continent, which has understandably ruffled some feathers. But does investment in Antarctica necessarily mean there are ulterior motives at play? Nobody has ever suggested that the Zhurong rover is fossicking for gold on Mars. Like space, Antarctica is an area for scientific research and, for the most part, cooperation. China has been a member of the treaty since 1983. As such, it agreed to all terms of the treaty. When New Zealand committed $357 million this year to redeveloping Scott Base, nobody batted an eyelid. There's healthy suspicion and perhaps a faint bit of nationalism at play, as new countries join the treaty. Pakistan, India, Belarus, South Korea and Japan have all added to the 70 or so temporary research bases on the continent, none of whom were original members of the treaty. It may be neutral territory, but geopolitics above the 60th parallel are rarely left behind on the ice. There is oil, but even the most optimistic of surveys admitted that it may never be cost-effective to drill for, if it were ever allowed. As the US review concluded in 1990, the Antarctic recoverable resources are probably nil. Building Antarctic research stations is not going to make anybody rich, but that hasn't slowed the rate at which new Antarctic programs are popping up and new bases are being planned on the ice. However, there are other disruptive forces that have emerged over the past 30 years, one of which has sailed in via the back door.
New Zealand is one of the 7 claimants. Historically, it's been one of the more relaxed claimants, but it's become less and less relaxed over the last 10 years. And the kind of de facto corporatization of the New Zealand Antarctic program has meant that you now have a body of people who think in commercial terms. And that's the Board of Antarctica New Zealand. And I think that they are rather keen on hardware in the Antarctic, because you never know how you can use hardware in the future.
Professor Hemmings is aware that there are new commercial pressures coming into bear in Antarctica.
A glorious Scott Base might actually be usable as a scientific station and be very much nicer than the present one, but 10, 20 years' time, what is to stop it being turned into a hotel? Because when you look at the imagery, Antarctica New Zealand's architects and Antarctica New Zealand themselves, it looks rather like a high-end lodge up in the Southern Alps.
Not even a consideration back during the first Antarctic Treaty. It's not oil, not research, but tourism. that is the single largest reason for bringing people to the continent. In 2019, pleasure seekers outnumbered scientists and government contractors 13-1. In the Antarctic summer of 2018, there were 56,000 tourists, compared with a peak population of 5,000 researchers. Antarctic tourism has already become the continent's biggest and only industry. Since the early 1990s, tourism operators have gained representation at the Antarctic Treaty meetings. IATO, the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, was started to make a framework for the growing number of cruise ships turning up in the South Seas. This has, of course, had benefits, setting a standard across tour companies wishing to sail south of 60 and promoting safe and environmentally responsible travel in the fragile polar environment. It has also meant that private companies suddenly had a seat at the table with treaty countries. Even after the current pause in cruise operations, the projected growth is only upwards. Looking forward to 2022 and beyond, there are ever more ambitious itineraries, promising trips to more remote parts of the continent, experiences no one else will offer. How about bathing in geothermal lakes within the Antarctic Circle, or a day flight to the geographic South Pole?
And I think it is a possibility that in a future, a glam building like Scott Base could be used for something else. Secondly, it's the perception of other states and actors. If they think that countries are hedging their bets, does that make them more likely to hedge their own bets or view country X's commitment to science, the Antarctic Treaty, whatever it happens to be, in a different way?
This growth in tourism has been virtually hidden from New Zealand. Currently, tourists visiting the Ross Sea and the area south of New Zealand account for less than 1% of Antarctic tourism. This is all set to change. Heritage Expeditions, New Zealand's only sub-Antarctic cruise operator, is swapping out its old 50-passenger expedition ship for a larger, more comfortable 140-passenger liner. They are also said to be joined by at least 5 other companies offering cruises to the Ross Sea in 2023. Whatever setbacks Antarctic tourism faced during the coronavirus pandemic, Heritage manager Aaron Russ says it's predicted to be back with a vengeance.
So it's not a very big stretch of the imagination to imagine maybe another country that also, like New Zealand, would approve its own activity, because that's how the Antarctic Treaty works, is each country approves its own activity. There's a template with the Scott Base redevelopment for building a beautiful luxury alpine lodge in Antarctica. And
for your researchers.
If you've got a runway and you have a commercial partner, maybe that's not for your researchers, and there's no reason why that can't occur, and that's my personal prediction on where you'll see tourism activity developing in Antarctica. Is on that side of the runway we have the research base, on this side of the runway we have a commercial facility, and that can all be approved by a single country.
The vast majority of tourism operators and their guests value the pristine natural landscape. It's unlikely that one would take such a trip if one didn't. They all want to do their part in protecting the fragile environment. However, it isn't the trampling of penguins or breaking off of ice sheets that experts are worried about. It's the increased pressure on an ageing treaty, which was never expected to account for so many people. In an increasingly crowded sea, the risk of something happening, which could endanger not only the treaty, but hundreds of lives, is also growing.
I was an Air New Zealand senior training and check captain who had flown to Antarctica, but I was unable to get the Air New Zealand Chief Executive Officer, Maury Davis, to budge from the flying in cloud pilot error theory.
On the 19th of November, 1979, a sightseeing plane departed for Antarctica from Christchurch.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's most of the sightseeing that we'll be able to see today. We're heading north, and we'll certainly see some more open water, etc. And on the right-hand side, of course, our Mount Erebus and Ross Island. But on the left-hand side, this cloud bank is rapidly coming in.
It never returned. All 257 people on board died. What came to be known as the Erebus disaster for the mountain on which the plane crashed, it is the greatest loss of life in a single incident on Antarctica. The memory of Air New Zealand Flight 901 still scars Antarctic tourism today.
No, and it's an interesting psychological study in a nation that, no other country has stopped flying to somewhere else because a plane crashed. I do think Erebus casts a shadow over the psyche, not just of New Zealand's Antarctic activities, but over the psyche of New Zealand as a whole. If a plane from New Zealand were to have crashed in any other continent, would we have stopped flying there? But simply because I can't think of any airline that's pulled out of an entire continent simply because of a single event.
Though scenic flights over the ice have continued from other countries, no Kiwi operator has dared launch an Antarctic sightseeing flight since.
If you look at the example from the other main gateways, particularly Chile and Argentina, that they're really taking a slightly different tack in terms of what New Zealand's doing, and there's an opportunity there, and if New Zealand doesn't take the opportunity, as a personal prediction, others will.
As a New Zealand-operated aircraft departing New Zealand, 200 of those aboard were New Zealand citizens. It was the country's largest single loss of life in the most remote corner of the world. The errors which led to the fatal crash could not be hidden. In 1981, the Mahone Inquiry was able to find justice for the families on board. The long and difficult legal battle is excellently detailed in the Herald podcast Litany of Lies. I'd very much recommend you listen for a fuller picture. Erebus was a uniquely New Zealand disaster. However, if you imagine it was not a DC-10, but a ship carrying hundreds of nationalities, owned by a US company, based out of Panama, maybe even flying a flag of convenience from Bermuda, then how much more difficult would it be to get to the bottom of it?
As tragic as it was, the Air New Zealand disaster in Antarctica didn't necessarily have many of those very difficult legal dimensions because it had such a strong connection with New Zealand in multiple different ways. So the application of New Zealand law in that setting was relatively straightforward.
As one of the leading experts in polar international law, Dr. Donald Rothwell has been increasingly concerned about the growing activity in the South Seas. As the size of tourism outings in Antarctica grow, so do the risks. Especially if you look at the size of the ships and the ever more remote areas cruises are pushing into.
Would New Zealand or Australia be able to respond to a major maritime incident in the Southern Ocean? We've seen a little bit of that play out in the context of some of the incidents involving Japanese whaling vessels and Sea Shepherd, of course. And of course, the Sea Shepherd vessel was scuttled in the Southern Ocean around 10 years ago as a result of a collision between a Sea Shepherd protest vessel and a Japanese whaling vessel. But that's on relatively small scale compared to what could happen if there was a major incident involving a tourist cruise ship in the Southern Ocean.
As an operator of shipping in the Ross Sea, Aaron disagrees. He sees more shipping in Antarctica as the only way to reduce the risk of those sailing in the region.
It's actually a shared responsibility that sits across all parties that are present in the area. And I remember a number of years ago now when the Japanese whaling fleet had a fire on board, and we were put on standby as the nearest available vessel to potentially go and effect the rescue of the whalers.
It's his view that New Zealand should be welcoming more shipping in the waters.
As a mariner, you can't have politics. You have safety of life at sea as the is foremost, and you'd expect the only way the system works is if you apply the same principles that you'd hope that somebody else applies, which is if there's a need that they would come to your aid. The best coverage of the region as a whole is actually going to be by having a number of parties that are present, and that holds true for most remote regions of the world where countries have search and rescue control responsibility, but have limited availability of assets, that all participants in the region carry a burden of responsibility.
Rescuing whalers is one thing, but cruise ships are a very different prospect. Should something go wrong in such a remote place, the implications are enormous. New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been firm for years on its view of tourism. It is to provide minimal assistance or hospitality to tourism vessels. but there is some sense that this hardline policy is thawing.
I guess MFAT sets New Zealand's tourism policy, and New Zealand's always been active in tourism discussions within the Antarctic Treaty. So, the MFAT tourism policy is, I think, dated 2003, and so that's been our stance for a really long time, largely as you described. So,
Ceisha and Antarctica New Zealand is preparing for a future where there are more, not fewer people in Antarctica. As New Zealand reassesses its place in Antarctica for the next decade, to 2030, the arrival of more tourists seems inevitable. In fact, it's spelled out as a key factor in planning New Zealand's priority for the next 10 years.
We've had a pandemic where numbers almost dropped to zero. I think there were 12 tourists in the 2020-21 season.
Probably stuck there.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some great stories between those 12. But,
yeah.
It's from 60,000 to 12. That's a real crash.
Yeah.
It has all stopped. But
well, I guess the question is, has it provided an opportunity for the parties to actually manage it differently now, before those numbers go straight back up? You're going to build a new ship in today's standards. Of course, it's going to have more capability than the older ships. And that capability, I guess, kind of changes the way tourism has traditionally occurred in Antarctica, which we call ship to shore. So people are on a ship, they get off the ship onto a river dinghy or a Zodiac, and they go to shore for a short period of time and then come back. So with that new capability, I think the ships can go further, and if you've got more interest in Antarctica because there's more money or people are want to see it before it melts, then those ships will start doing the circumnavigation trips. So traditionally it's based on the peninsula. You've got high numbers of ships there, and I think the Ross Sea region is of interest because of the history. So largely people want to go and see the historic huts. And so if those tour companies have a more capable ship where they can fill the berths, then they will start offering more of these circumnavigation trips, which will do a trip from the peninsula to the Ross Sea side, and then do another trip back. So yeah, I think the trend is that we will see more ships in the Ross Sea.
If New Zealand cannot stem the tide of tourism to the region, perhaps it will have to find a more active way of guiding tourist numbers. Now, you might remember this episode began with the plan to ship icebergs to Africa. This hot topic is likely to become more pressing and less fantastic as we draw closer to 2048. Like cruise passengers, climate change was not a factor given any consideration in 1959. Thanks largely to the science done in Antarctica, climate change is a widely accepted fact. But it also remains part of the world most susceptible to temperature increases that show no sign of slowing. Should reserves of fossil fuels run low, there is unlikely to be much leniency on countries wishing to exploit Antarctic claims. But should there be a catastrophic shortage of, say, drinking water, priorities could shift. In the climate of the next 30 years, there are some Antarctic minerals which Ceisha is concerned may only become more valuable.
When you were talking about prospectors and mineral resources, I think it's more likely that natural resources will be the target sort of thing that people may or may not want from Antarctica, be it water or that bioprospecting topic that we discussed, or harvesting stuff from the Southern Ocean. So I think that could be a real possibility in the future, depending on how climate change impacts the globe, particularly in certain areas. Water is definitely a commodity in some places, and I think I've read somewhere that somebody has already investigated whether or not towing icebergs north would be a way of capturing more water.
Tony King of Seacor is something of an iceberg expert.
Locally here in Newfoundland, we do have a small iceberg water harvesting industry. We have ice beers and iceberg vodkas and liquors, etc.
Director of ice engineering for 25 years for the Canadian company, the majority of his work is not about drinking water. Climate change must be bad for business if you're an ice engineering firm.
That's not true, actually. So climate change, what it does actually is it makes a lot of the north more accessible for shipping. So that's actually become a bit of a growth area there. I think the biggest iceberg we've ever towed here has been on the order of, say, 4 to 6 million tons. But something that size only gets towed if it wants to. Put it on a tow which could last a month, you're looking at burning a lot of fuel.
I guess you could have been using that fuel to boil off water in a desalination plant.
You know, I have often wondered about when you look at Antarctica and you know the vast quantities of of ice and meltwater, especially coming off of Antarctica, whether or not it's actually possible to somehow simply take that water. We're going to get around this treaty thing, I think, is the biggie.
It's hard to say what the most pressing issue will be by 2048. With pressures from tourist traffic, mineral shortages, or even climate catastrophe, there are challenges on the horizon for all treaty members. The deadline is, we can now all agree, largely imaginary. But it has entered the discussion as a key year. Like Y2K, today it's easy to see the Millennium Bug as a punchline. But in the lead-up, it was used to justify all kinds of behaviours. Even if the end result was only a few misprinted bus tickets or errors in school calendars. As a tool for peaceful cooperation, the Antarctic Treaty is the most successful agreement of its kind. The review date has been easy to catastrophise, simply because there are unavoidable challenges in Antarctica's future and unaddressed problems frozen into the treaty.
And that, I think, is the kind of real concern. So the Antarctic system is unstable because we've collectively got the jitters about the future. And so you don't need to go into the details of the Antarctic Treaty to kind of understand that. It's really quite familiar global geopolitics.
As an ex-polar conservationist who spent many hours studying skua in the southern seas, Dr. Allen sees the motives as a bit less nuanced. The move from Antarctic conservation to geopolitics and game theory might not initially seem like an obvious one. That is, until you've met an Antarctic skua. Big black birds that are notoriously aggressive, circling over the Southern Ocean, their intentions seem nothing but peaceful. The moment they sense there is something to be gained, they are quick to swoop. You have been listening to Detour Antarctica. This podcast has been written and voiced by me, Thomas Bywater. Each episode has been mixed and engineered by Tash Chittock, with special thanks to Ethan Sills, Francis Cook, Steph Holmes, Andrew Laxon, David Rowe, and Nadia Tolich. This series wouldn't have been possible without the translation of Damien Venuto, and input from the experts and scientists that call Antarctica home. Ceisha Poirot, Alan Hemmings, Aaron Russ, Donald Rothwell, and Tony King. For imagery, details, and Herald Premium content on the Antarctic stories we covered, and to find more podcasts like this one, go to nzherald.co.nz or listen on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts.